Welcome back to the KDPG Sunday edition. This morning we're talking about President Donald Trump's scheduled meeting with North Korean President Kim Jong-un next month, and this past week's release by the North Koreans of 3 Korean Americans after a year in prison. Back with us is Dr. Ryan Grauer, the Associate Professor of the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. And joining us is Dr. Samuel Stanton, Professor of Political Science and Chair of that department at Grove City College. Dr. Stanton, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to pull something from your bio that was given to us, and one of the quotes is about studying political science, that all political actions were caused by something and that these political actions cause other outcomes. What caused this recent political action that we're seeing?
What's the cause behind having the summit or the release?
Well, the summit.
Okay.
We'll start with the summit.
Start with the summit.
Because I'm guessing that the release has something to do with the summit, but you may have a different thought about that.
There's a lot of pressure being placed upon Kim Jong-il right now, and Kim Jong-un is following from his father from China. When there was simply the case where you had with the grandfather, with Kim Il-sung, being able to play the Soviet Union against China and finding some way to get what was necessary to keep the country running with 2 potential benefactors. It was easier movement for North Korea in that setting. When the Soviet Union no longer exists to be played with China, or played against China even, to support North Korea, it starts becoming a much narrower scope of support for North Korea, narrower range within which they can act. And so you started seeing more aggressive saber rattling about the nuclear program under Kim Jong-un's actual father, his father, Kim Jong-il, that startled everybody and started us down a road to discussion of, well, then what do we do to deal with a nuclear capability in North Korea? And for the Chinese, that nuclear capability in North Korea is almost just as scary as it is for anybody else in the world. Yes, they're supposedly friends, a client-patron system perhaps, but having a nuclear power in an unstable setting such as that of the Korean Peninsula for China causes the Chinese to put more pressure. And as the Chinese have realized, because of the sanctions in place, just how much they are the lifeline for North Korea.
So in World War II, Hitler had pretty much dictatorial power not only over his own country, but over the leaders of his client states. So there was no negotiation. We know exactly what happened in Munich, for example, and later on. Austria. Did the leaders of China say, okay, pal, this is what you're doing, or was it more subtle than that?
I think with the Chinese, it's always a little more subtle than simply, this is what you're going to do. But notice that Xi and Xi's representative didn't go to North Korea.
The other way around.
Kim Jong-un went to China twice in the last 2 months to visit.
Well, anybody would want to get out of Pyongyang, so that's...
that could be. Ryan, because you raise an interesting point. Is it the chicken or the egg? Which came first here? Dennis just indicated that these talks are coming about because of sanctions that were imposed on North Korea through the years, not just the recent ones, and some push from China. Or are these talks coming about because we and the rest of the world are reacting to the nuclear arms that North Korea has developed? Or is it a combination of those two?
Yeah, I'm going to do the typical professor thing and give you a third answer.
Okay.
So countries tend to get nuclear weapons for some mixture of 3 reasons. 1, for security. 2, to be seen as a major player in the international realm, and 3, to deal with some sort of internal domestic pressure. And so the economic sanctions certainly play to that domestic pressure, because even a dictator like Kim Jong-un can't be completely unresponsive to the conditions of the population that he rules over. But the primary driver, as far as we can tell, because we have limited knowledge about North Korea and Kim Jong-un, is that security was really driving the North Korean decision to nuclearize over the years. And this isn't a new phenomenon. This is a long-standing program. So it was a security concern, and once they had that, their security problem was more or less solved because the U.S. isn't going to invade. But then comes along the international recognition concern. And so how can these weapons be used to bolster North Korea's international reputation? Well, you get a bilateral agreement with the most powerful country in the world by asking for it. There's a reason that the United States has avoided bilateral talks with North Korea for decades. We've insisted on multilateral talks, but now Kim Jong-un has gotten that. And so from my perspective, where I sit, just looking at sort of the strategic logic of things, this summit is part of a North Korean effort to deal with those 3 concerns: security, international recognition, and domestic politics.
But hold it. If the security concerns are really phony, because the United States was never going to attack, there's no time since 1953 in which the United States plausibly would have a pretext or any kind of incentive to invade North Korea. Who wants that place? So wasn't the whole thing a pretext for economic aid sometime down the line?
Well, you say that from our perspective. I think you're right from our perspective, but thinking from the other side of the hill, from the North Korean perspective, this is a country that after World War II was given its borders by great powers. It tried to revise those borders and was put back in its place by the United States. And there was an armistice signed, not a peace treaty. And so technically we're still in a state of war with North Korea. And
a lot of people are technically married, but they're living with...
That's fair, but a marriage going south isn't an existential threat for either partner, right?
Well, it depends, yeah, but okay.
Ideally.
Okay.
But it could be for North Korea. And so, especially after the 1980s, when you see South Korea really ramp up economically, it becomes harder and harder for the North Korean leadership to sell this story that they are this workers' paradise. And they start repressing, and the leadership in North Korea, they're certainly rational, and they're not unintelligent. And they know what they're doing is not regarded well by the international community. And so they're still technically in a state of war with the most powerful country in the world, and they're engaging in behavior that could lead to all sorts of pressures, economic, military, and otherwise.
Dr. Stanton, if I can ask you this part of it's going along the same way. We've hardly touched on the fact that the 3 people who were held in a prison in North Korea were released. The previous one, Won-Breer, I think the North Koreans just didn't want him dying in their hands at this particular time. Holding Americans as prisoners is not necessarily something new that North Korea has done through the years. You go back to the Pueblo incident, and they held 30-some American sailors, and one of them died. They were all eventually released. What point does this release of the prisoners play in this whole scenario? Is it? I mean, because you take a look at it and you say, well, North Korea, from typical Americans' perspective, well, we got North Korea to come to the table to talk. He's said he's not going to use nuclear weapons. He says he's already going to tone down the number of tests and everything else that he's doing, and he's given us the prisoners. It looks like we're winning everything, and so what is he going to get out of this?
What does he get out of the release of those 3? Hopefully nothing.
Okay.
Hopefully there's absolutely nothing given for the release of those 3 hostages. Hostage diplomacy. That's what I believe the Kim regime is playing with this, hoping and to be able to play to that domestic audience. I have given something in return for this. We get the bilateral negotiation.
Okay.
From our perspective, does this change anything that should be discussed in a month in Singapore? No. The same issues should still be on the table, the same requirements for a settlement for a long-term bilateral or even multilateral if we bring in other states. Those agreements, that there should be denuclearization, that it has to be irreversible, that it has to be something that can be overseen by the United States or by some other third party to be able to verify it. Those things have to stay on the table. The question of North Korea's human rights record has to stay on the table. Hopefully, we're not going to give any of that away simply for the return of 3 hostages.
Right. Okay, but we are basically out of time. Are you optimistic something will happen, just yes or no?
Something will happen. I don't expect it to be terribly meaningful in the short or long term.
All right. Thank you both for being with us this morning on the KDPG Sunday edition. David and I will be back with some final thoughts in just a moment.